Newton came to be thought of as the first and greatest of the modern age of scientists, a rationalist, one who taught us to think on the lines of cold and untinctured reason. I do not see him in that light. Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians.
Recently, I came across a book called Isaac the Alchemist, Secrets of Isaac Newton Revealed, by Mary Lozer. And I found it at my local library, actually. And the interesting thing about it isn't just that it talks about Isaac Newton's involvement with alchemy, which has been documented many other times and places, but more so because of how much it actually is celebrating alchemy, and very fascinated with it as a topic. And from what I can tell, it's even most likely geared more towards younger readers. I don't know what age group, but it's, maybe a junior high level, elementary, junior high level. It's not an adult book, so it's celebrating Isaac Newton's alchemy not as some sort of dirty dark secret, but quite the opposite. And there was just a few portions in it that were quite telling that I was just going to read real quick. In the prologue it says this: "In a museum in New York City, locked away where the public never goes, there's a notebook small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. Its pages are yellowed and stained with time, but the writing has not faded. The boy who owned it was small for his age. He had pale red gold hair and blue eyes that bulged slightly. His name was Isaac. A secret for travelers," he wrote in his notebook. "A miraculous stone." So perhaps he knew even then about the Philosopher's Stone, which was said to turn ordinary metal into shining gold. The magician scientists known as alchemists were searching for it. If they could discover the Philosopher's Stone, the alchemists thought, not only could they change lead into gold, they could also make an elixir that would cure any disease. They could live forever. Someday, though he didn't quite know it yet, Isaac would begin searching for the magic hidden in old and musty books of alchemy. He would stand over cauldrons, adding secret ingredients and watching as poisonous vapors rose and swirled. He would become the world's greatest alchemist. He would also, by following his own odd and lonely path, become one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. His discoveries about light and how objects move through space would unlock the mysteries of the universe, and the name Isaac Newton would be famous forever. Far in the future, scientists would use Isaac's laws of motion, which are the foundation of the science we now call physics, to send rockets to the moon and beyond. Don't laugh. But for now, he was only a boy living at a time when no one knew where magic ended and science began. He dipped his quill pen in an ink pot and wrote in his notebook, thinking hard. And so the book focuses mainly on his childhood and growing up in the apothecary's house. Apothecaries are much like alchemists in many ways. And so he was exposed to, it talks about this book of mysteries that he had. And so how that sort of, at a very early age, set him on this path of being interested in the esoteric and magic and all this type of stuff. And then going on through his interest in astronomy and astrology, and then eventually to where he goes to Cambridge and becomes a student, gets into alchemy, eventually, meets Halley and all the rest, and becomes the famous scientist that we know him as today, and the head of the Royal Society and all that. But this last little bit at the very end is also quite intriguing. In 1936, a set of Sir Isaac Newton's manuscripts were on sale at an auction house in London. The man who bought them, a famous economist named John Maynard Keynes, was startled to see how many of the papers had to do with the musty, magic-tainted false science of alchemy. How could it be that Isaac Newton, who had burned many of his old notes, had decided that these were worth keeping? His selection of the Alchemical MSS manuscripts is exceedingly queer, Keynes wrote. Most difficult to attribute to the same brain as that which produced his other works. Isaac Newton was not the first of the Age of Reason, Keynes realized, astounded. He was the last of the magicians. And yet, this magician, this last sorcerer, this greatest of all alchemists, was the same man who banished magic from the scientific world. An alchemist is someone who transforms one thing into another. And this, Isaac had done. And it's just absolutely fascinating. The more you learn about the person of Isaac Newton and understand what alchemy really is, it really just baffles me on two separate points to ponder. The one side being the matter of Christians, creationists, who cling to this idea that the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution, the Renaissance, and so on, was largely motivated by quote-unquote Christian principles and biblical principles, and they really perceive science and the Royal Society and Isaac Newton as largely Christian figures and products of the Christian mindset, in complete disregard to the facts which point to occult inspiration of so many of the ideas and so many of the practices that then became what we now call science. And on the other side, it's astounding to see non-Christians who do come into this sort of cosmological reevaluation to where they are understanding so many of the deceptions of scientism, whether it's Copernicanism and the heliocentric model or relativity or gravity, so many of these things, and they're able to recognize that these are not scientifically demonstrated realities at all, but nevertheless they still remain fascinated with the underlying spiritual teachings of Hermeticism, Kabbalah, and alchemy that were fueling all this deception in the first place. And it is with those two considerations in mind that I have assembled this admittedly non-linear compilation of excerpts and material that, in my mind anyway, speaks to this whole issue.
The aim of science is to try and find patterns and regularities in nature. The first success was actually in astronomy, because the ancients realized that the planets moved in regular courses, the seasons and the calendar were regular, and they were able to understand these patterns to some extent. It took much longer to achieve any success in subjects other than astronomy, because the stars and planets in their courses display far greater regularity than almost anything else we can study in nature.
In trying to understand how we got here, science turned from patterns in the heavens to patterns here on Earth. Was there a common essence from which everything was made? We've always suspected that in some mysterious way we were connected to the world around us, and that despite the apparent complexity of the world, this common essence could be found by reducing everything into its basic parts.
The Greeks did this, and many of them had the idea that everything was made up of four substances: earth, air, fire and water, in different combinations. That was a marvelous unifying idea. We now realize it didn't explain things in detail.
People have always been asking these big questions, I think, for as long as humans have walked the earth. And the big change is that now we have measurements. We have data. It started out with the chemists realizing that even though there seemed to be thousands of different kinds of stuff, there was only 100 or so different chemical elements out of which you could build everything else.
To create a sorcerer's stone that changes base metal into gold and an elixir that can bestow immortality. Today, these notions are the stuff of fantasy, consigned to fictional realms where wizards weave spells. But for 300 years, until the late 1600s, the golden age of Western alchemy, these objectives were considered logical and attainable.
Actually, science and magic, at least in the early stages of civilization, were not as disparate, were not as distinct as we now think they are. If you think about it critically, in magic, you take a series of objects and produce something totally unexpected from them. In science, you can be doing very similar looking things.
European scientists of the 13th century, men known as alchemists, took up the quest for the Philosopher's Stone. This mysterious compound, they believed, could be made into an elixir which conferred immortality, or added to base metals like lead to produce gold. Though their objectives appear occult to our rationalist eyes, they had solid scientific reasons for believing it was possible.
In working with metals, it's very easy to change one or two of the properties. For example, we can take copper and make it yellow like gold or white like silver. We can change the hardness and softness of metals. So alchemists naturally made the extension, if we can change one or two of the properties, can we change all the properties?
If we do this right, if we choose the right ingredients, if our conditions are right, then we can take a mixture of something else and apply a particular material to it and make something that really is gold.
The alchemists called the concept transmutation, a process they saw at work all around them.
If we look at nature around us, it's dynamic. Things are always turning one thing into another. So grape juice turning into wine and then into vinegar. Or in the organic world, caterpillars turning into butterflies. So if this sort of change is normal in the natural world, why shouldn't it be in the world of minerals as well?
The ancients had the belief that this was also true of things that grew in the earth. That is to say that base metals might slowly in the earth turn into more noble metals, might turn into gold.
Just as you could maybe speed it up by putting a plant in a pot on a windowsill, you could speed up the process by taking metals, minerals, putting them in a pot, using a steady heat, maybe a higher heat than would be experienced in the center of the earth, and essentially just speeding up what was a natural organic growth process.
If alchemists could, with the help of the Philosopher's Stone, speed up the aging process by which they believed lead matured into gold, then, logically, they should be able to slow that aging process as well.
What brings it all together is a desire to manipulate time.
In the alchemical mind, the same purification process that could turn base metal into gold could also create longevity, and perhaps even immortality.
Just as it could remove the impurities of the metal and perfect them into gold, so too some European alchemists thought that the Philosopher's Stone could be a powerful medicine, that it would remove the impurities and the imbalances from our bodies and restore us to perfect health.
The transmutation of gold was simply a sign that they had been successful in their work, which was to transform nature, but also to transform themselves, and ultimately to attain immortality.
The psyche is in darkness, and it needs to be liberated from that darkness, just as the gold is brought out of matter in alchemy. So, in liberating and bringing to your conscious mind what is unconscious, you're performing a kind of alchemical process.
Whether you go through the process of psychoanalysis or whether you are puttering around in your lab until you have achieved the Philosopher's Stone, it's the same thing. Once you have achieved yourself, you have become a self-actualized person, you have achieved the Philosopher's Stone, and metaphorically and psychologically, you have achieved transcendence.
Jung's psychological interpretation of alchemy remains controversial, but he has not been the only 20th century thinker to investigate its mysteries. At Harvard University in 1941, physicists brought the power of the atomic age to the ancient alchemical work of transmutation. Using the newly invented particle accelerator, they bombarded 400 grams of mercury with high-velocity neutrons and transformed a tiny amount of the mercury into gold. This was the first scientifically documented transmutation in history.
The ancient and medieval alchemists, or even the early modern alchemists, did not have anything like the energy at their disposal that one has in a modern nuclear accelerator or cyclotron. And in fact, this does not provide any justification for thinking that the alchemists really were able to perform genuine transmutations of metals, just because modern physicists can do it. On the other hand, it does offer a sort of a latter-day justification of their theory, their belief that elements could be transmuted.
The physicists bombarding mercury with radiation until they created gold may have actually done the transmutation the hard way, and there may actually be a simpler method of transmutation locked within the alchemist's manuscripts and the engravings upon the cathedral.
The Harvard experiment that demonstrated a minuscule transmutation of gold is, in my way of thinking, not a vindication of alchemy, even though it's an interesting experiment. What's more important to me is to try to find the underlying energy that the alchemists understood and worked with. I think it's not so important to prove that it's possible to make transmutation. To me, this is a given.
Even today, there are those who pursue alchemy's ancient quest, gripped by its seemingly timeless allure. Russell and Sue House are contemporary alchemists. For them, alchemy is not the pursuit of wealth. It is a search for the deepest spiritual truths.
As a modern alchemist in the 20th century, I'm not interested in making gold. It's not because I don't believe it could be done. I think my interest in alchemy began when I was a child. I was very inquisitive, I liked nature, but I was also very much involved in my church, and I liked the things I heard there. I thought that if people could see what I had seen through a microscope, that they would see that it's evident that there is some kind of God.
I have found alchemy to be a way to travel within myself. And so it's not just a process for me of watching an experiment taking place, but it's going within me and finding parts of myself that I didn't realize were there, and being able to mesh that into my life and use it and grow from it.
It occurred to me that, like most people, I'd been searching for happiness outside of myself, and I was having the realization that I might never be truly happy unless I went inside my own mind to look for some answers. Albert Einstein famously said, "You can't fix a problem with the same consciousness or thinking that got you into the situation." What this meant to me was that if I wanted to solve a problem in my life, or if we as a society wanted to solve some of the big problems we have, like violence, eco-destruction, addiction, depression, we needed to change our collective consciousness. Could society use some of these ancient techniques for its modern problems? I was inspired by people who came before me that seemingly had it all, but chose to take the risk of going inside their own minds. These people were what I would call psychonauts, sailors of the mind. And I saw that these people were going inside their minds and exploring inside their minds as part of what they wound up doing. And I thought, wow, I have to do that.
Put something in the pot.
I figured before I got too extreme and sat with a shaman, I should go out and talk to some of Deepak's friends about our so-called reality.
If you only identify with the realm of three dimensions, if you only identify with the realm of the body, if you only identify with the mortal circumstance and the mortal experience, then to that extent you are at the effect of those circumstances. Faith is standing on the conviction, standing on the knowledge and the conviction. There's something way bigger going on here.
What we see is only a small portion of the total reality. See, we have three states: waking, dreaming, and sleeping. But beyond that, there is a state where it's neither of these three, but there is a restful alertness that dawns deep within.
There's nowhere where we escape from being energy, so we're always energy. What we see as it looks physical material is actually the reflection of light, photons of light that hit our energy and bounce back. So we're reflecting light, but we're reflecting it as a force field, a tornado of energy.
If we can stand within the unreal world, the ultimate unreal, that appears real, that seems limited by the laws of time and space, and yet have faith in the realm beyond, that literally invokes that realm into being.
It seemed like what everyone was saying is reality's just a concept. I needed to have the direct experience of going inside. Could ancient wisdom have included plants and meditation? I was excited to learn that a lot of celebrities, people like Jerry Seinfeld, Martin Scorsese, were doing this meditation for a long time. And recently, people like Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Oz and Katy Perry had taken up the meditation, and it seemed to be making them even more creative. I wanted to see if some of this ancient wisdom could help me to tap into my creativity. In the 1960s, a funny little man named Maharishi Mahesh Yogi came out of the Himalayas to the United States, and he wound up teaching his transcendental meditation technique to the Beatles, and the rest is history. Today there are more than 7 million people worldwide doing transcendental meditation. What I like about the TM technique is that there's no dogma attached to it. It's really just a simple technique of silently repeating a mantra to yourself, which causes you to transcend into your quieted mind, to subtler and subtler states of consciousness, until a point that you reach a place called universal consciousness, an endless field of energy that connects all of us, where all knowledge is contained and where everything is manifested from. When the Maharishi passed away in 2007, he put John Hagelin in charge. As a quantum physicist and a meditator, he had successfully used quantum theory to support Maharishi's model of creative intelligence being at the center of all creation.
Waking consciousness is all about being aware of something, this, that, this concept, that person. Transcending is leaving all of that behind to isolate and experience the self itself. It's blissful. It's not the end of the story. 10, 20 minutes of that is enough. The idea is to come back into activity and increasingly integrate and stabilize the experience of inner reality, inner silence, along with outer reality. And that's when life really gets to be.
Raymond Lully, who was one of the great early alchemists, once pointed out that the great tragedy of the concept of alchemy was the transmutation of metals. Basil Valentine, monk of St. Bennet, had the same thought when he wrote into one of his books, "Woe to the gold makers." Now this is an interesting thought because our subject this morning essentially is esoteric alchemy. And the history of alchemy itself divides into two distinct branches that have descended from antiquity, possibly originating in Egypt. The word chem in both chemistry and alchemy is an ancient name for Egypt. El is divine or sacred, and we find it used in the Bible in such terms as Elohim, and of course the deity of Islam is Allah. The divine prefix would indicate that alchemy is a spiritual art, a divine secret science. The great texts of alchemy have come principally from the Hermetic background at the beginning of the Christian era. And probably there were alchemical schools in Alexandria at that time. Also, we have early records of alchemy in China and in India. And it seems that from a very far back, there has descended a double concept of chemistry. Physical chemistry having to do with those areas of knowledge which are now considered scientific, and spiritual chemistry, which was definitely a sacred art. In practice, what is the difference in these two systems? I think probably Paracelsus summarized this rather well when he pointed out that the alchemical transmutation was impossible unless the alchemist himself was in the process of transformation.
This is the drawing that my favorite drawing from that time, and the one that really made me decide to get into alchemy. And it's called Tabula Smaragdina by Daniel Melius, and it's a very popular book. Here's a version I've restored and colored and enhanced to talk about. But and I won't go through all the details here. It has every symbol in alchemy combined in here, but it's also a beautiful layout of the alchemical principles and Gödel's proof. What you see is that horizontal layer below, which is divided into the left and right, darkness and light, which also applies on a psychological level, masculine and feminine. And they come together in the alchemist at the center there, who is bringing the opposites together in himself, the material and the spiritual, and incorporating them into his own consciousness. And by that act, by that sacred marriage, he's able to enter this realm above. The feminine alone is chained to these clouds of unknowing, and the masculine is also chained to these same clouds. I mean, they're white in the sense that the masculine motive is logical, and the feminine is intuitive or from feeling, and in the darkness. And lots of things going on here, the elements at the bottom. But you can enter into this phase above, this spiritual realm, which is above the horizontal line. And you see there a sun with lots of archetypes. These are angels, which mean they're archetypes in archetypal energies that the universe has. And there you also see three larger circles representing in alchemy, sulfur, mercury, and salt. In Christian terms here with the lamb and the tetragrammaton and the dove, yes. And so we've got spirit and soul and God above in Christian terms. But it's sulfur, mercury, and salt, or energy. Sulfur is energy in alchemy because it is an energetic thing. It makes acids, that liquid fire. Sulfur burns. It's called brimstone. So alchemists really didn't have a term for energy, and they used sulfur, philosophic sulfur, and the idea of sulfur to try and convey energetic terms. And the salt is matter, material things, and mercury is represented by a god that can travel between two realms and work in both realms. The secret of this drawing that's not in any text, and it wouldn't be, is this bigger sun behind this forward sun here. It's called the black sun, the sun behind the sun. And it represents the sun that is behind the whole universe, or the one mind. And what has happened in alchemical theory and modern physics, actually, is that there exists this one mind outside the universe who projects this other sun, if you wish, or fire and light into the darkness, into the emptiness that creates a new universe. And what happens is this new engine of reality is full of archetypes and set principles that will unfold over time. and it's called Mind the Maker, which is very clear, I think, about the kind of matrix that this is. It's nature. It contains everything in nature and everything in us, all our psychology, all our emotions, and it's just blown into the universe. And it's a process that continues by itself. It's a natural transformation of spirit into matter. And that takes place, and that's the whole principle of alchemy. Right there you find alchemy unfolding. And that's what the alchemists tried to find with these basic principles. So Mind the Maker, in a way, though, is an enemy in alchemy because it is very much like a matrix that you're caught in. And it's limiting. In the experiments, over time, over thousands of years, things will perfect themselves. But the alchemists wanted to hasten that process and use those principles to hasten the perfection of matter.
The backlash against alchemists came from various civic authorities or even national authorities banning the practice of alchemy. It was really more a secular backlash against citizens being defrauded.
After the Renaissance, alchemy began to be called chemistry. Though both words are derived from the same Greek root, cheo, chemistry eventually became the more popular term, and was in the end a way for scientists to distance themselves from the imputation of fraud and black magic that continued to taint the study of alchemy.
Down to about the end of the 17th century, the words alchemy and chemistry were synonymous. They were used largely interchangeably. It only comes later, in the 18th century, that the two split into pretty much their modern meanings.
People began to decouple alchemy from chemistry and began to associate chemistry with the kinds of assaying and weighing and quantitative methods, and also the interest in qualities of chemicals, from alchemy, which they now started to speak of as only the transmutatory art of turning base metals into gold. There is a kind of artificial divide between alchemy and chemistry.
Where chemistry is a modern science, and alchemy is this sort of shady, somewhat disreputable practice that you really don't want to be involved with.
For the last 200 years, scientists who have looked back on the period have deemed the search for the Philosopher's Stone a fool's quest, and alchemy itself a pseudo-science. But that assessment is changing.
Many of the techniques of chemistry, even if they were not initiated, invented by the alchemists, were nevertheless perfected by them. And we're talking about such fundamental operations as crystallization, distillation, sublimation, fundamental processes in chemistry.
If you went into a chemist's laboratory in the middle of the 20th century, you would often see the same sorts of glassware and see the chemists doing the same sort of operations that you would have seen had you walked into an alchemist's lab in the middle of the 17th century.
Alchemy also had a direct effect on some of the world's greatest scientific minds, Isaac Newton in particular.
We have over 1 million words that Newton copied out from alchemical texts. So clearly, he was a very close reader of these texts. We also know that he worked in a laboratory doing alchemical experiments. One of the matter theories that the alchemists held was that matter was made up of tiny corpuscles that could combine and had specific properties. And Newton seems to have borrowed a good deal of this material in his own science.
In both science and fiction, alchemists are making a bit of a comeback. In the book Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Nicholas Flamel, Dumbledore's unseen partner, is said to be 666 years old. The author J.K. Rowling isn't the first to suggest that Flamel didn't die in the early 1400s.
Several centuries later, there are records of him being in India and in Uzbekistan in Central Asia, and even appearing in the opera in Paris in the 1870s. Did he acquire the Philosopher's Stone? Perhaps he's still alive today.
John Dee, whose quest for the Philosopher's Stone drove him to despair, is also enjoying a resurgence of popularity.
Dee's works are published and reprinted. They're very popular among New Age spiritualists. You can even buy transcripts of his conversations with the angels in case you want to try this at home. John Dee would have been extremely gratified to know that the fame and recognition that eluded him under Elizabeth I has in some respects been given to him in the 20th and 21st centuries.
As for the alchemist's central ambition of finding the philosopher's stone and transmuting substances into gold, that objective is now possible.
We can transmute in the sense that nuclear reactions can take the nucleus of other elements and turn them into the nucleus of gold. But the cost for that, in terms of building accelerators, operating them, having the crew and so on, is millions, if not thousands of millions of dollars per microgram of gold. It isn't worth doing.
And what about the stone's other attribute, that of extending human life? For people in the rich West, in an age of wonder drugs, health clubs and cryogenics, our life expectancy gets longer every year. Though the ultimate prize of eternal life has so far eluded science, the quest continues.
The dream of immortality is certainly a very old and, I think, persistent human dream.
So perhaps the dream of the alchemist is not so absurd.
Today I'll tell you kind of a grand story, which is our thinking of space and time, and in some sense what is the role of geometry, mathematics in understanding the universe. And this goes back certainly to the beginning of modern science. This is a wonderful image of Galileo, of a book of nature that is being read, but before to read it you have to know basically the language in which it's written. And for Galileo this was the language of Euclidean mathematics, triangles, circles and other geometrical figures. And I think this is a long tradition. If you go back in more recent history, for instance Richard Feynman, a famous particle physicist, he has said that if you really do not know mathematics, don't be worried, there won't be many equations today, but if you don't really know mathematics, you can't get across the real feeling of the beauty of nature. Now, Feynman is also famous for having said that if all mathematics disappeared today, physics would be set back exactly 1 week. So, and I always thought this was a very clever remark until a famous mathematician gave the right response to this and said, well, this was the week that God created the world. So I say 2-to-1 mathematics to physics. The amazing thing is that the kind of mathematics that we're talking about today is in some sense very far away from our everyday intuition. We talk about the very large-scale structures in the universe, the theory of relativity, the very small-scale structures, the quantum theory. And I think we're living an amazing time where these two concepts are actually coming together. It's really this snake biting its own tail. And it's actually happening right in that time that we are now in the history of science.
I'm Clee Irwin, and I direct quantum gravity research in Los Angeles. This talk is called The Quasi-Crystalline Nature of Consciousness in the Universe. Our mission at Quantum Gravity Research is to discover the geometric first principles unification of space, time, energy, matter, information, and consciousness. Our physicists and mathematicians have developed an E8 quasi-crystal quantum gravity framework based on the golden ratio and Fibonacci chains. It holds special promise for resolving the quantum decoherence problem that stands in the way of useful quantum computing technology. It is showing a path forward in understanding low-energy nuclear reactions. But most importantly, if we are successful, this model will be the only microscopic first principles theory of everything. So it will provide an explanation for the fundamental constants, such as the speed of light. And it will dissolve the philosophy that consciousness, including universal consciousness, is in a separate realm from the geometry of reality.
Today I'm looking at Hermetic principle number 1, found in the Kybalion, and that is the principle of mentalism. So what does the Kybalion, which is part of the Hermetic corpus, that is the teachings of Hermes, have to say about mentalism? I'm reading this directly from the Kybalion, and then what I'm going to do is give you a commentary and some study notes afterwards. Number 1, the principle of mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. The Kybalion. This principle embodies the truth that all is mind. It explains that the all, which is the substantial reality underlying all the outward manifestations and appearances which we know under the terms of the material universe, the phenomenon of life, matter, energy, and in short, all that is apparent to our material senses is spirit, which is in itself unknowable and undefinable, but which may be considered and thought of as an universal infinite living mind. It also explains that all the phenomenal world or the universe is simply a creation, a mental creation of the all, subject to the laws of created things, and that the universe as a whole and in its parts or units has its existence in the mind of the all, in which mind we live and move and have our being. This principle, by establishing the mental nature of the universe, easily explains all of the varied mental and psychic phenomenon that occupy such a large portion of the public attention and which, without such explanation, are non-understandable and defy scientific treatment. An understanding of this great Hermetic principle of mentalism enables the individual to readily grasp the laws of the mental universe and apply the same to his well-being and advancement. The Hermetic student is enabled to apply intelligently the great mental laws instead of using them in a haphazard manner. With the master key in his possession, the student may unlock the many doors of the mental and psychic temple of knowledge and enter the same freely and intelligently. This principle explains the true nature of energy, power and matter, and why and how all of these are subordinate to the mastery of mind. One of the old Hermetic masters wrote long ages ago, "He who grasps the truth of the mental nature of the universe is well advanced on the path to mastery." And these words are as true today as at the time they were first written. Without this master key, mastery is impossible, and the student knocks in vain at the many doors of the temple.
And the main way that happens is because, I think, and this is my opinion, and we're going to talk about some of the myriad views surrounding this, but it's because there is consciousness extended into the world of nature. And there's many, many philosophies. I mean, most philosophers and idealists have tackled this question in some way or another, right? And they kind of mostly disagree with each other, and then they all come up with the same theory and name it different names. So when we're talking about panpsychism, one of the things you're going to find out is that there's also all these other names that it's called too. So you'll be like, oh, I totally heard about that, but it was animism. So the reason that it gets so spread out and crazy is just simply because there's all these philosophers that want to try and make you think that they thought of it first, so they call it their own word or like name it after themselves or something like that, which is really irritating when you're trying to get down to the bottom of these ideas and philosophies, right? Because you're like going on this trek like Dr. De Quincey does in Radical Nature, where he's looking at all these different philosophies, right, for how consciousness is in nature. And he literally is going through like all these different people, and you're reading and you're like, well, they're all saying the exact same thing, but they just all have to call it their own thing and make their own manifesto, and then they steal it from the Greeks or from the Egyptians, and then they say, oh, this is occasionalism, or it's animism, and I totally figured this out because I know what it is. So that's something that's really frustrating, and the only reason I'm going to talk about these philosophies as such under their titles and names, and even the word panpsychism, which was thought up also by a philosopher who gave it his own little name, is to try and get that into your heads that this is a recurrent idea that keeps coming up through different philosophers, but in fact goes all the way back into the shamans. Again, we find it with shamanic origins, and into the fairy people and the fairy faiths and all that kind of fun stuff, which is the fun part of what we'll be talking about today, instead of all these really important sounding philosophers from Europe that like to try and steal things from primitive cultures and make it sound like they're very scholarly.
So that process just happens to be beautiful physics, namely the physics of phase conjugate optics, which we know accounts for self-organization in physics, and it accounts for time reversal, which simply means, as you know, time just names rotating charge. So the ability to send waves faster than the speed of light causes them to enter time. And we'll talk more about that. But the summary is simply that no system will emerge into life or gravity or self-awareness that is not fractal in both space and time. And that is the discussion. I'm pleased to say the headline in New Scientist magazine, "Fractality Makes Sense of Quantum Mechanics," beautifully verifies what we've been announcing for many years, and I was the first to announce that fractality is the electric cause of gravity, and the mathematicians are getting on board. It's really wonderful. So I do highly recommend the most spiritual science you might study, which is that of fractality.
I do geometry, and I calculate geometrical objects. Oh, there we go. This is the configuration of regular tetrahedra called the 20 group. When you restrict all of the side lengths to be unit length, what happens is you get gaps. The idea is you rotate everything until it locks in place. The notion is that down at the Planck scale in space, everything is discretized into a point space. And we think that this is representative of the structure of the Planck scale discretization of space. So we're working with E8. It's an 8-dimensional lattice of points being projected down into 4-dimensional space, and then from there we project it down into 3 dimensions to get something that we think might be the point space that the universe operates on. So here we have points in space. A lot of these points are in 4 dimensions, so I can rotate the points in the 4th dimension. This is just a projection down into 3-dimensional space. And I'm highlighting some vertices off and on randomly. The vertices are taken from the point space. And here I can view them and really get a feel for what I'm looking at. Well, let me get some more vertices going. Wow, that's a lot. There we go.
What is this? Other than
So,
super cool.
This is a set of points that I'm working with. Down at the Planck scale, we believe that space is quantized distance-wise into a set of points. Instead of being a smooth manifold, a smooth space, a continuum, that really you have one thing jumping to the next point, jumping to the next point, and that's what motion really is, traveling from one vertex to the next. Here is part of that.
It's like a video game.
Mm-hmm. Except more fun, because I create it.
So is reality a video game?
Well, that's the real question. Is reality made out of actual stuff, made of things? Or is it more of a moving, you know, is it just all information? Is it all ethereal? You know, can you go down to the atomic, subatomic, quantum level and see things moving around, or is it just really a collection of information? That's the question that's being asked by QGR. That's the question at the heart of our research.
Early on, people thought that what was up in the heavens had nothing to do with us. They didn't even think that the same laws of physics apply to the heavens as to us. This idea is very deeply entrenched in much Greek philosophy, for example, that the heavens, these crystal spheres, why doesn't the moon fall down on our head? Because it's a heavenly object, it's not a rock.
But the truth is quite different. Not only does the cosmos obey the same physical rules, it is made of the same atoms. The first clue to this came from the Sun. It is 92 million miles away, yet astronomers can tell what it's made of from right here on Earth.
If you take light from some source on Earth, and send it through a prism, you see these spectral lines in there which tell you what it's made of. So when this was done with the sun, they saw these spectral lines of hydrogen. And for the first time ever, did somebody realize that this most central object that everybody before them had seen, was actually made of Earth stuff. That's been a really shocking revelation, which has come gradually, that stuff up there has everything to do with us.
And every star that we analyzed confirmed the same story, no matter how distant. It seemed that the entire universe was made of the same 92 elements.
It's remarkable that the substances which make up ourselves and everything on Earth are, so far as we can tell, identical to what we find in the Sun and in the most distant stars.
So the question was no longer, where did the stuff of our planet come from, but where did the stuff of the universe come from?
We believe everything started off in a so-called Big Bang, a very hot, dense state, nearly 14 billion years ago.
The Big Bang is the cosmologist's story of how everything in the universe was created in a giant explosion. But the early universe contained a far simpler atomic mix than today. In fact, just two elements existed, the simplest atoms imaginable.
If you'd been looking at the universe when it was, say, a few million years old, it would have been a rather boring place. It would have been at about ordinary temperatures, sort of temperature we're at in this room today, but everything in it would have been just a very diffuse uniform gas, nothing else. That gas would have been just the simplest atoms, hydrogen and helium.
But what transformed these two most basic elements, hydrogen and helium, into the 92 elements that make up every galaxy, every star, every planet, and on Earth, everything from crystals to us?
We want to know how, from that simple beginning, everything transformed into the cosmos we see around us today and of which we're a part.
The transformation occurred because simple atomic matter was not all that existed. There was a force, an ever-present fundamental force, that to this day is both familiar and strange.
The main force that changed the universe from being simple and boring to being rich and complex was gravity.
We're used to gravity's effect on Earth, but gravity extends throughout the universe. It keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth, and the Earth tied to the sun. It holds all planets to their stars. It causes stars to cluster in their billions to form galaxies. Wherever in the universe there is matter, gravity tries to draw it together.
The more stuff you have, the more gravity there's going to be. Nobody is above the law of gravity who's made of matter.
And from the beginning, the clouds of hydrogen and helium atoms were subjected to the gentle but ever-present force of gravity. And we see the results wherever we look in the night skies.
Early on, if you had a large cloud of gas, it would exert a very, very large pull on all the gas around it, which would result in the whole thing contracting together and getting smaller and hotter and denser. And gradually this gravitational contraction would overpower the pressure which was trying to blow it apart, to the extent that it would get so hot that you would make a star.
Sometimes people ask, why should we be interested at all in these stars? Stars thousands of light years away, which live out their lives and then die. And the answer is that there's a rather intimate link between these stars and us on Earth. Had it not been for these stars, we wouldn't be here.
Throughout the ages, alchemists, people dreaming of getting rich, were trying to make some elements out of others, typically expensive things like gold out of cheap things like lead, right? And all they achieved typically was lead poisoning. But they weren't actually wrong. We now know it is possible to do alchemy and create new elements out of others. It's just that you need much more energy than those guys had in their makeshift little chemistry labs. You need so much energy that in fact only stars can provide them.
Through our own pride, the world has been transmuted. God's creation, which testifies to His majesty, turned into an endless ocean of idolatry. A mystery to be solved. A centuries-long quest to save ourselves, an inquiry, experimentation, and human wisdom. Such is the folly of man.